But Christ the King is a relatively recent addition to the church calendar. In the Roman Catholic Church, the Feast of Christ the King was added to the liturgical calendar in 1925. In 1970, it was moved to the last Sunday in Ordinary Time, which for us is today, the last Sunday after Pentecost, for all intents and purposes, the New Year's Eve of the church calendar. So why not party? Celebrate the coming of Christ, who is the King. It reconciled the practice in the Western Church and in certain Protestant denominations with that of the Eastern Church that had practiced Christ the King. The Orthodox communities have celebrated Christ the King for many years. And the question I think should arise to us is, just what kind of king are we coming to expect? We'll turn the page on the liturgical calendar from year C to year A next Sunday as we begin Advent. And we'll start to look forward to the birth of Christ, the birth of Jesus in a small hilltop village outside of Jerusalem. And this birth of one human being has changed all of human history in profound and meaningful ways. But what does it mean to say that Jesus is our King? In the first century, it was very much of an in-your-face to the Roman Empire. We talked about this a little bit in Bible study this morning. The greeting among folks in the Roman Empire when they would gather and greet one another on the road in occupied lands was, "Caesar is Lord." The head of the empire was considered to be a deity, and it was a very countercultural and subversive thing for the earliest Christians to be usurping that and to say in competition with this proclamation that Caesar is Lord, in saying Jesus is Lord. To say that Jesus is Lord, given the facts of the case, is countercultural. But the long-term reality and implication of a new kind of kingship continues to dawn on the church as we go through the ages. We asked the question of groups in Bible study this morning why you thought they might have chosen these particular readings to celebrate the feast of Christ the King. We talked about what our notions of royalty are, and we got some very uplifting and edifying attributes of royalty. Benevolence, justice, truth, honesty, goodness. And I had to be the naysayer and say, well, I think about kings and royalty sometimes. I think about despots. I think about dictators. I think about greed. I think about obtaining power at all costs. And I think that to just demonstrate that there are competing notions of what royalty is, and it's especially complex for us as Americans who declared our freedom from royalty some 230 years ago, but by the same token seem endlessly enthralled by the British royal family. It doesn't make sense to me somehow, but there is something mythic about royalty. The divine right of royalty, the special favor that's conferred upon them, and we need to deal with how we consider Jesus to be our King. And when we look at Jesus as our King through the lens of today's gospel reading, I think we might come to a little bit of clarity. I grew up in a church in Boulder, Colorado called St. Aidan's, and in the church building, before we expanded, there was a large Christus Rex that hung over the altar in the main church building, and it was Jesus in glorious robes with a crown and wearing still his wounds, the holes in his hands, the holes in his feet, the hole in his sides. That's a different kind of royalty than I think most of us imagine. And it is that paradox that I think we need to embrace when we deal with Jesus as our King. Not someone robed in glory. Remember that he was put upon him the purple robe as a means of mocking him, not as honoring him. But Jesus as our King, as depicted in this bit of the Passion of Luke, is about a suffering God. A God who came among us, who is characterized by compassion. The word compassion literally means to suffer with. And that, I think, gives us ample insight as to who this King is for us. That it is royalty that embodies all that is good about what we talked about royalty to be in our earlier conversations in Adult Forum. Compassion, justice, righteousness, generosity, advocacy, caring for all of God's people, all of their subjects. The Feast of Christ the King helps us to rehabilitate the negative connotations of royalty that might be competing with that. And we learn to understand God in a new way. That God comes to suffer with us. And in fact, we will start to sing next week a compelling call for God to come be with us as we start to sing, O come, Amen. Which means God is with us. God with us is the promise that allows us to hope as the people of God. It is not a promise that everything is going to be okay, that no problems are going to come your way. It is the promise that whatever will become our suffering, our passion, that God has promised to be with us. And we will see that as it's bracketed in Matthew's gospel that we're going to study over the next number of weeks in adult formation and also on Thursdays. That Jesus starts in Matthew's gospel by being called Emmanuel, and at the very conclusion of Matthew's gospel promises the disciples to go forth as he gives the Great Commission of going forth to preach the gospel and to baptize, promising that he will be with them even to the end of the age. We serve a King who first serves us, who continues to serve us, and will keep us in his own heart as we continue as the church militant, as we've been described, the church here on earth. Militant in that we're working toward the mission that we have, the mission that God has given us to proclaim the gospel to the ends of the earth. And then until that work is done, we cannot think of ourselves as a church triumphant. Because through too much of human history, the church has visited some rather lamentable actions upon people in the name of God that might help us to back off from triumphalism as a practice of the church and continue in the following of Jesus to be servant, to be the servant of all. Jesus, in all of the Gospels, never once says, worship me. Jesus says to what? Follow me. And if that following is through this passion that we listen today, that our way to become part of the royal family is to expect the suffering that will come our way as the inevitable result of living in a broken world, and will allow us to trust that God will be with us always, and that though the world may be a scary place, we need not live in fear. I love the fact that Christ the King has moved to this time of the year. It used to be celebrated in a different part of the liturgical cycle, but now it always falls very close to Thanksgiving. And one of my other favorite events has also, not favorite so much as momentous events, also occurred around Thanksgiving. How many of you can tell me what happened on November the 22nd, 1963? All right, what else happened on that day? C.S. Lewis died on this day, on that day in 1963, as did Aldous Huxley, oddly enough. There's a stage play that imagines the three of them together as they are waiting to be called into paradise and having a conversation about the state of the world. But C.S. Lewis perhaps has done as much in the 20th and into the 21st century of making the gospel available to all sorts and conditions of people, whether it was through his radio addresses on the BBC or his large volume of writings that has spanned drama, poetry, science fiction, apologetics for the church, and children's fantasy. And I think perhaps one of the best depictions of the nature of God as King comes in one of my favorite of Lewis's works, The Chronicles of Narnia. And nowhere has he synthesized that better than in the first volume of that trilogy. As the four children go through the wardrobe and into this imaginary and wonderful world where, oddly enough, it's always winter and never Christmas. They have an encounter with talking beasts, wonders galore, a white witch. It's all there. But in a brief conversation between the children and Mr. and Mrs. Beaver in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think Lewis comes as close as anybody I've known of helping us to understand what it means to put ourselves into the care of God in Jesus. As they've gone through the wardrobe into Narnia, the children meet the beavers, and they're brought in out of the cold and fed and nourished, and they are set on their tasks that are set before them. And Mr. Beaver says that he's in talking about Aslan, the lion that's on the move, where hope is starting to spring into Narnia. He says, Aslan, he'll put all to rights, as it says in an old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. When he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. You'll understand when you see him, said Mr. Beaver. But shall we see him? Asked Susan. Why, daughter of Eve, that's why I brought you here. I'm to lead you to where you shall meet him, said Mr. Beaver. Is he a man? Asked Lucy. Aslan, a man? Said Mr. Beaver sternly. Certainly not. I tell you, he is the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know he is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Ooh, Susan said. I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I'm longing to see him, said Peter, even if I do feel frightened when it comes right down to the point. We're going to turn the corner into a new liturgical year that we call Advent. But remember that we can't have an adventure if we don't first have Advent. And the adventure to which we are all called is to give ourselves over to the trust of Christ our King in new and challenging ways. When the rich young ruler comes to Jesus in Mark's gospel, it says that Jesus, looking at him, loved him. One of my bishops said, when Jesus loves you, look out, because you never know what you will be asked to do. When we come to Jesus, when we come to what we perceive to be an innocent-looking child lying in a manger that's cute and cuddly, remember that that child, that cub, just like Simba,